Our next speaker is a technical talk given by Professor Jordan Awan. Jordan just recently became a CERIAS affiliated faculty, although you're in your third year at Purdue? Fourth year at Purdue. Had called me on the telephone and said, "Hey, my peers say that I should be affiliated with you." And I said, "Well, what are you working in?" And said, "Differential privacy." Said, "We need to meet." So right away, in our very first conversation, I said, "Why don't we have you present some of your research at the symposium in a week from now?" So so this is one of our newest affiliated faculty members. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Jordan Awan. Who is in the statistics department here at Purdue, presenting valid statistical inference of privatized data.
All right, thank you very much. Is the audio okay here? Okay. Yeah, thanks to Joel and Sean for giving this opportunity to talk today. So we'll also be talking about differential privacy, but from a different perspective. So again, just to motivate why we care about privacy. So before differential privacy came along, there's been lots of techniques for de-anonymizing data. The obvious thing would be to remove names and obvious identifiers. But especially with increased computing power and algorithms, it's been shown that you can essentially identify people using what seems like boring pieces of information, such as your gender, zip code, marital status, things that might be publicly available, and that these essentially give you a unique fingerprint that would be on a record, even if your name is not on it. So something more secure than this, which is where differential privacy comes into play. And one of my motivating examples is the US Census. So they've also been using leading privacy protecting technologies for many decades. And in 2010, they did an internal investigation to see how secure their privacy protection was. And surprisingly, they were able to find that they could actually match almost half of the records, which were supposed to be anonymized or protected in some way. So this served as some motivation for them to look at more formal privacy protection, and they decided to use differential privacy, which has been incorporated in the 2020 decennial census release. This, from my perspective as a privacy expert, is a huge step forward in terms of formal privacy protection. It certainly brought a lot of attention to differential privacy as a field in technology, but it's also caused a lot of concern from the people that depend on the reliability or the utility of these data products. So there are lots of people that don't have, strong statistics or computer science background that still depend on these products to make policy decisions and other types of social and economic research. And because the way that differential privacy introduces noise or randomness to protect the data, this is resulting in data sets that are very hard to use and interpret. And if you pretend that they are the same as the real product without privacy protection, you get very strange and hard to interpret results. For example, looking at the impact on redistricting, this paper found that their disclosure avoidance system that the census is using with differential privacy results in a systematic bias where certain populations of mixed race or mixed partisan districts are biased in one way or another. And while there are certain patterns that can be identified, in general, there's an unpredictable bias that's very hard to deal with. So I'm using census as my motivation, but of course, lots of other companies and organizations are also using differential privacy, such as the tech companies, Google, Apple, Microsoft. All of them have research groups, and some are implementing these techniques. So this is some of the motivation. One, why do we care about privacy? But also this issue that even if differential privacy solves the privacy problem, it creates another problem. How do we make sure that these products are still useful for those who depend on them? How do we make sure we get valid inferences, meaning unbiased, meaning we can quantify our uncertainty of estimates? Those are things that we want to be able to do. So my cartoon picture of differential privacy is the idea that you change one person's data, you pass it into your privacy mechanism, and this adds some randomness. And after that randomness, we want this output to be roughly indistinguishable, even if you change that one person. And so given that output, it should be hard to tell which input you started with. And that's where the notion of privacy protection comes into play. And we're not going to need a whole lot of details on differential privacy, but just to give something a little more formal of how we might measure this closeness idea. One of the newer formulations of differential privacy is phrased in terms of a hypothesis test. So let's say the attacker has two guesses of what the database is. It's either D or D prime. And these two databases are identical except for one row. So they basically, the attackers figured out every person's data except one person, and they've nailed it down to one of two options. So it's a very powerful attacker. They have almost all the information except this last bit. And differential privacy says, well, even with all of that available knowledge, given the output of our privacy mechanism, it should still be relatively hard to tell whether that last row was one or another. And we can essentially bound the power of this test in terms of some other easier to understand tests, such as telling between two Gaussian distributions that are shifted by some amount. So the more these are shifted, the easier they are to tell apart. The less they're shifted, the harder. And this is a way of quantifying the privacy protection. So the shifting parameter is similar to the epsilon parameter mentioned in the previous talk, although they are on somewhat different formalizations of differential privacy. Reasons why we like differential privacy as a method of formal privacy protection. It has many nice mathematical properties that translate into real-world important aspects. So one practical thing is that we have a single number or sometimes a few numbers to quantify the privacy protection or privacy loss. A huge one is that it's robust against side information. We're essentially allowing the attacker to have almost all the information, so we don't have to worry about how they will attack the output. A huge one, especially as a statistician, is that this is not privacy through obscurity, but it is fully transparent. So with previous ways that the census would protect data, they would not tell you the exact parameters that they used when they privatized it. So they wouldn't tell you, for example, they had a method of swapping certain aspects of people's data. They wouldn't tell you the rate they were swapping them because they were worried if they told you that, that could be used in an attack. Well, differential privacy says that the algorithm or the source code is completely safe to release. This is important because the mechanism, the privacy mechanism, introduces randomness that has to be incorporated into your statistical reasoning. You have to include that in order to have a proper understanding of the uncertainty or bias that these are introducing. So we're going to leverage that property going forward here. And then some other things that I won't get into huge detail, but if you publish two things with differential privacy mechanisms together, they have some privacy guarantee. Post-processing says that we can use any sort of procedure to refine a differential privacy output. And as long as we're not looking at the sensitive data again, it doesn't break the privacy guarantee. If you have a guarantee for changing one row, you automatically get a guarantee for changing, say, a family of size K, maybe that's 4. So these are kind of selling points for why differential privacy has become so popular as a formal privacy mechanism. Essentially, no competing methods have been able to match these sort of guarantees. And there's many very clever and complicated privacy mechanisms in the literature. But for illustrations here, we're going to use just one, which is fairly simple, which is that for a statistic, meaning some function of the data, we're going to make it privatized by adding Gaussian noise to it. And that noise needs to be scaled according to the sensitivity. And sensitivity is a measure of how much the function changes when you change one person's data. So if one person could make this statistic change wildly, we have to add a lot of noise to cover up that person's contribution. On the other hand, if it were, say, a count statistic, one person only changes the count by 1 unit, then you need less noise to cover up that person's contribution. And then we had this mu parameter, that was the distance between the Gaussians. If you have them closer, that's a smaller mu. You divide by a small number, you get more noise as well. So hopefully this is reasonably intuitive. This is the type of mechanism we'll use just for our illustrations. And just to get a picture ahead of what this a privacy mechanism might look like, again, sticking with simpler problems. So let's say the data is just real valued, and we're going to say it's approximately normal. And we want to estimate things like the mean and variance of this. So this is very classical problems in statistics. You would learn this in your first statistics class. The first thing for privacy is that the usual summaries of the sample mean and sample variance, they actually have unbounded sensitivity. If I take one person to the extreme, I could change the mean as much as I want to. So actually, we have to change the statistics first by clamping the data to some bounded range, which is going to introduce a bias, because we're not going to get the real mean back. We're going to be truncating those values that are too high or too low. But once we clamp, then we can just add noise to sample mean, sample variance. And just to kind of see what this looks like, here's the sample mean, sample variance, and the true values are 1 and 1. We see the cloud is centered around that. These are unbiased estimators. We understand their sampling distributions and statistics. After clamping and noise addition, though, the cloud's over here, and the value we're trying to estimate is here. So this is going to be an illustration of the type of problem we're dealing with when we're trying to get the correct inferences. So let's talk a little more about what we mean by statistical inference. The first is the distinction between the data set and a population. So we have data, but we imagine that this data is representative of some larger population. For example, if we have a survey of Americans, then what we're really interested in is the whole US population, not this survey of people we have. But sometimes it's even more general. In scientific studies, you might have your population be maybe human beings in general, something like that. So sometimes it's more abstract. But this raises the question, well, what if we had collected a different sample in a similar manner? We want to answer questions like, is the pattern in the data real, meaning it's representative of the population, or was it just due to random chance from the sampling randomness? So to make this more precise, we assume a model, which is some description of this population that generated the data. And there's some quantity, often called theta, which we're trying to learn, such as the population mean, or in a regression, is there truly a relationship between two variables? What's the slope of that line? And I would say if we boil it down to maybe three key questions, tasks that we want to do as statisticians. The most basic is just to estimate theta. That's the first thing. But especially in scientific settings, it's crucial to quantify uncertainty about that quantity, such as by a confidence interval or a Bayesian probability, as well as something like a hypothesis test, looking for evidence whether the data gives us reason to reject a previously held belief about theta. And I'm going to focus on these last two because these really require understanding uncertainty. And that's, I think, really a key thing that the statistical perspective provides. Also, just to mention, there are two different philosophies of statistics that we'll consider both of them. If you've had some maybe undergraduate statistics class, you've probably learned the first one, although they may not have used the term frequentist. But here the philosophy is that theta is some fixed but unknown quantity. Maybe there's some true mean of the US population. I couldn't measure it because I can't ask everyone, but there's some value out there. And then what we mean by our statistical guarantees is if we imagined repeating our survey or our sampling over and over again. And the types of things that you calculate in this framework are confidence intervals and hypothesis tests, which you've likely heard of. The other philosophy is called Bayesian statistics, which is becoming more popular. And it changes it a little bit by saying that, well, actually, that thing I don't know could be viewed as a random quantity with its own distribution. And then when you do your statistics, what you think of is, well, what is the distribution given the data I observed? And then this is called a posterior distribution, and this can answer similar questions in a different way. Often these give similar results, but not always, and there are different approaches that can be applied to the same types of problems. And again, to make another distinction of what we mean by doing statistical inference with differential privacy, you could imagine one of two scenarios. In the first, let's say I worked for a census. I do not. But if I did, I could have some say over what privacy mechanism they would use. I could say, well, I think that it's really important to do these types of regressions, and maybe this type of privacy mechanism here. So you could customize the privacy mechanism for the inference task. But the situation we're in now is that the 2020 census already released. I didn't get a say in what privacy mechanism is used, and yet I still, if I'm, say, working with a social scientist or economist, I still have to learn the statistical questions I want to learn. So I have the DP summary. I know how it was generated. I don't have the original data anymore. And all I'm really doing is processing this summary statistic, the DP summary, to do my inference. And my work and my lab have worked on both situations, but for this talk, we'll focus on just the after the fact, saying, well, we'll say the privacy mechanism has already been decided. It might not be optimal at all, but we're going to do the best we can to answer the questions that we want to answer. So again, just to make it really clear what our framework is, I'll call X the original data. This is the data that was once collected. We're assuming it's faithful. There wasn't any data poisoning in this case. If we had the data X, we could probably do the inference we want to because there's a lot of standard statistical methods. But we don't get X. Instead, we get, I'll call it Z, which is what the census published or whatever organization is publishing the private mechanism. So we want to still learn about theta. That's our population quantity. But all we have is Z. That's the private quantity. Okay, and the mechanism is fixed and known. F is the model we've chosen for the real data. And we have to deal with randomness from both the data sampling and from the privacy mechanism. And again, we have no access to the real data, which is usually required for most statistical methods. So let's come back to this, again, motivating problem. Well, most classical statistics methods use knowledge of the sampling distribution. What's the distribution of these quantities we have? Well, that's one of the key problems, is that after this clamping and adding noise, the distribution becomes very complicated and doesn't fit into the families of distributions that we're used to working with. So, and this is maybe more for the technical people in here. If you're familiar with a likelihood function, this is one of the techniques used in classical statistics. Essentially, what happens here is if you try to write out the likelihood, you have to integrate over all the possible data sets, which is becomes a very large problem that can't be solved even with our computing power. So some challenges that we have here is we don't have the original data anymore. People have tried plugging in the privatized data into traditional methods and have not gotten good results because it doesn't take into account that bias and randomness introduced. Many methods require clamping in order to bound the sensitivity, and this introduces a complex bias that's hard to incorporate. And then this likelihood function I mentioned is intractable, which is required for a lot of other approaches. So essentially, almost all the existing methods have problems that can't be easily applied to give good inferences. But we do have some things that we can leverage. One of the big ones, this is again, that we're allowed to know the privacy procedure, the algorithm that was used. And this is a very important thing we want to leverage. Because this has been implemented by the organization, it should be relatively easy to sample. Sometimes it's, may take a while, but we have a way to sample it. And often, if we're using something like the Gaussian mechanism, the density is also easily evaluated. I'll also mention that the privacy mechanism that the census used is similar to the Gaussian mechanism. They used a different distribution, but it's similar. So we're going to really leverage this knowledge of where the privacy noise came from in order to enable our inference on the privatized data. So I'll talk briefly about two projects from my group that I'm really excited about that give some of the first steps in providing valid inference under either the Bayesian or frequentist regime. So first I'll talk about the Bayesian approach. And I won't talk a lot about technical details, but maybe just some of the highlights. So this distribution, the parameter given the private data, is what we want to understand. And in Bayesian statistics, it's very common to produce a sampler, to produce random samples. And from those, you can approximate anything you want to from this posterior. I mentioned before that this doing this directly would involve an intractable likelihood, so that you could not do this using a standard method. And we came up with a way to exactly sample from this distribution. Or I should say the Markov chain has the correct target if you run it long enough, with only a few mild assumptions that we could sample from the model. This is what generated the data. We can evaluate the density of the mechanism, and that if you had the real data, you would be able to do the Bayesian inference, that you could get theta given the real data. So this is nice because it's sort of a wrapper. If you would know what to do with the real data, then we can just incorporate something about the privacy mechanism to give a way of learning the parameter given the privatized data. And it's also a fairly user-friendly procedure. You don't have to tune any parameters. We have bounds on the efficiency. And I'll show you an example how we apply this to a simulated problem. So here's an example of a type of problem that you might want to analyze. So here, this is a discrete problem. So you could imagine some survey where there's some answers. You're going to check A, B, C, or D. And there's some class that we were trying to understand, and we have features associated to the class. So somewhat similar to like a discrete regression type of problem. What we're really interested in estimating would be something like the probability of being in a class given certain features. And this model has a simplifying assumption, and then essentially you can tabulate the what are called sufficient statistics. These are the summaries that code all the information, which is all the crossway counts of the class with each feature. And then for privacy protection, we'll add some noise to each of those counts. So then every count has noise added to it, and we want to learn about the underlying parameters, such as these sort of probabilities. So in the simulation, we chose some values for these, and we're going to show how the method works. So in this simulation, we'll fix the private or the sensitive data set, keep that fixed, and then run it over and over again with new privacy noise and running our sampler. Here, the dotted line is the prior mean. So this is if you had no data, you would just guess this value. And the solid lines is if you had the real data, what value you would learn by a Bayesian analysis. And this shows that as the privacy degrades, we approach the non-private conclusion. But as the privacy gets stronger, we get the prior conclusion. And so this matches our intuition here. Okay, and then I want to talk about another project. Again, I won't go into a lot of details. So this is the frequentist setting. So we're going to think of confidence intervals and hypothesis tests. And again, usually, traditionally, this would be done through understanding the distribution, such as by pen and paper calculations. But we can't do that because it's intractable. But what we can do is sample from the model, sample from the privacy mechanism. And so what we're going to use is called simulation-based inference. And the way you think about this idea here is we're going to assume that we can decouple the source of randomness from the parameter. So in a simulation, if you're familiar with some programming, you have this idea that there's a seed to the randomness. So it's all really pseudo-random, that if you fix the seed, it's now deterministic. Well, this is the case with most distributions that you might use in statistics. You can separate out the randomness from the parameters. And the value of that is that if we hold the randomness fixed, we could try out different values of theta, see what data they produce. So there's like a green point cloud here, a blue one, and a red one. And then if those point clouds look like our observed data, well, then that was a plausible guess of the parameter. Essentially, then, all the plausible parameters become a confidence set or confidence interval for that parameter. So there's definitely a lot of technical things I'm skipping over here, but this is now an alternative approach to classical statistics where we're sampling repeatedly to figure out what thetas are plausible candidates. First, I'll show the toy example, which was our illustration earlier, where we saw the point cloud was far away from the star. Well, using one of the leading methods in the literature, because of that bias, it's called the parametric bootstrap, we get under coverage for our confidence intervals. These are supposed to be 95%, but they're missing. They're down to 80, 85. And so these are not properly calibrated. You would be overconfident that your interval is correct when it's actually too narrow and not containing the real value enough. And this method, which we're calling repro sample, is giving, in fact, slightly conservative coverage for the same problem. So in that toy example here, we now have a solution to give properly calibrated intervals. Another problem that's a little more complicated is a linear regression. So here we have a continuous response and continuous predictor. We're trying to estimate the line between them. Often the type of thing you're interested in is to determine if the line is horizontal or not, meaning the relationship or not. And we're going to be comparing against a method that was published in 2022 in NeurIPS, so one of the leading machine learning conferences. We're going to use the exact same private summary statistics as them. So all that changes is the processing, where they had a customized procedure just for this problem. And we're going to apply our general procedure based off of our simulation-based inference. And this is a hypothesis testing problem. So here on the left, the alternative hypothesis is true. So we want these values to be close to 1. That means we have a high power that we're rejecting the null when we're supposed to be. And on the bottom is their approach. And we see that they do pretty well. Like they've got a lot of 1s here and so on. But we're actually getting even more values close to 1. So we have higher power. And then what's, in my mind, even more important is the type 1 error. These are the probability that you are making a mistake of rejecting when you should not be. Here, these are supposed to be calibrated at a type 1 error of 0.05, which is a standard level. But in their approach, which again published in a top machine learning conference, they're getting type 1 errors up to 67%, a sort of catastrophic failure to control the type 1 errors. Ours are, again, over conservative, even though that's not hardening our power too much. We're well below that level. And this is, again, showing the value of coming with a principled statistical approach is, again, using the exact same summaries, we can get a more, both more conservative and more powerful compared to leading methods. Okay, so some takeaways here. I think that this is an important thing to focus on is another dimension of utility when thinking about privacy protecting techniques. Not only do we want to get the right answer, but we want to also be able to quantify uncertainty. These are things that scientists need for their work. They're also very valuable to understand how certain or uncertain we are with our estimates. And this requires new methods, both statistical and computationally. In order to do this, we can't just plug in these private summaries into existing methods. And so by ensuring our statistical inference, we can properly quantify our uncertainty and outperform existing methods which don't have the same statistical rigor. And there's lots of open questions that me and my lab are interested in. Optimizing statistical inference for various problems. In particular, if you say, well, now I do work at census, maybe I should not have used that mechanism in 2020. Is there a better mechanism? That's also an important question. And these are, I'd say these methods are maybe a little beyond proof of concept. They can handle small scale problems, but really scaling these up is another challenge. And then this is a general problem in privacy is that many methods are tailored to particular problems, but it's also valuable to have general purpose methods that can give valid inference as well. I want to show off some of my students. The top row, these are our current students. First, their PhD, and last one's master's, and a recently graduated student now working at Meta. Lots of collaborators, but I'll just highlight a few that are working on some key projects. These two are professors in statistics as well, Vinayak Rao and Nanchao Zhu, and then some external collaborators as well. And then I want to also acknowledge my support by NSF that's helping to fund some of this research. Thanks for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions.
If you have questions, please line up at the microphone.
Hi, so I'm Bree Abernathy with Rolls-Royce. I'm just curious about the implications for medical research. I can't help but to think of epidemiologists and other, it seems like, prime for this type of this application. So I'm just curious. I mean, you mentioned census data, which is important, but medical research seems very, very important. And just if you have any comments.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's not something I've personally worked in yet, but I would be interested to get involved. I do know of some existing research where they've tackled some problems related to clinical trials, genomic research. I think it's still quite young in terms of that area of application. I think there's a lot of room to develop both like customized methods as well as bring these approaches to real world applications. So I definitely agree it's important. I think it's something that I'd like to get involved in.
Jordan, thank you so much.